Good afternoon. I'm Burnis Morris, Carter G. Woodson Professor of Journalism and Mass Communications and Director of the Woodson Lyceum. And on behalf of Dr. Montserrat Miller of the Drinko Academy and the Woodson Lyceum, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for you showing up on such a beautiful day. You gave up your blue skies, sunshine, and spring-like weather. The Woodson Lyceum is a collaboration between the School of Journalism and Mass Communications and Drinko Academy, which jointly created this program through the strong support of the late Alan Gould, former executive director of the Drinko Academy, and Marshall University president, Dr. Jerome Gilbert, whom you will meet in just a few seconds. The Lyceum is housed within the School of Journalism in the College of Arts and Media. Dr. Gilbert will welcome you.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to also welcome you to the annual Carter G. Woodson lecture. I look forward this afternoon to hearing our very distinguished speaker, Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who will be introduced later in the program. I have cleared it with her, but I'm going to have to leave after I make these comments and go down to the Faculty Senate. I've got to make a few comments down there, but I'm coming right back up. So I hope to hear all of her talk. I want to thank Burnis Morris for the great job that he's done through the Carter G. Woodson Lyceum to plan what I think is a full month of activities during Black History Month. He's been assisted by Dr. Montserrat Miller of the Drinko Academy, by individuals in gender studies, our School of Pharmacy, and others to make sure that we have a very rich and educational series of events this month and throughout the year, and I'm looking forward to it. This is a very special month and indeed a very special year. We are in the month that Huntington's own Carter G. Woodson helped start, Black History Month. This year, as you will hear later, is the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment that removed barriers for African Americans to vote. It's the 100th anniversary this year of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. It's also the 55th anniversary of the 1965 voting rights, which removed some of the final barriers for African Americans to have the right to vote. This will be a very unique year of celebrations as we remember these milestone events that brought greater freedom and broader access in our country. But I want to hasten to add that we still have work to do to create an ideal society. We still have those who would want to make it difficult for some to vote and to express their opinions. We still have people who would rather have contempt for some of their fellow citizens rather than love. We still have people who would rather see us divided than see us united. We must not let these individuals distract us from our journey to ensure respect and equal treatment for all. We observe this month of Black history and this year of affirming voter rights, and I ask each of you to remember that in America, we can effect tremendous change by using the ballot box. So I encourage everyone to get out to vote and challenge our elected officials to represent the values and the beliefs that we know are right and just. I know that you're going to enjoy this program today. I will be back in just a few minutes, but thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert. I must recognize several people in the audience. First, Mary Nell Gould and her son, Charlie, from Alan Gould's family. Do you mind standing, please, so they can see you? Thank you. I also must recognize other supporters who support us in extraordinary ways. By that I mean members of our support group the Maple Grove Society. They make our programs work by generously contributing ideas to build and enhance the programs we offer. They also contribute their labor. For instance, if you received our holiday greetings, you probably noticed the envelope was handwritten. Several of our charter members addressed the envelopes. From the small to the big, they pitch in. I'm also going to ask the members of the Maple Grove Society to please stand. Dr. Gilbert is a member, so is our provost, Dr. Jaime Taylor, who can't be with us today. Many of the Maple Grove members are wearing Woodson pins commemorating the postage stamp issued in the 1980s, which recognized Dr. Woodson's contributions to America and the world. He created a movement for the appreciation of Black achievements in history, which had been denied by mainstream historians and society in general until Woodson's influence. It is a movement that is alive and well today. Progress has been made, but there is so much more to do. I hope that each of you will join Maple Grove Society and become part of the 21st century Woodson movement. We have information for you. Just ask me during our break or other members of Maple Grove. Today I am wearing two hats. In addition to the Lyceum, I am also a proud Distinguished Drinko Fellow. With the Drinko Fellows, please stand. And thank all of you for your support. The idea for the Lyceum evolved from my research project as a Drinko Fellow. Dr. Carter G. Woodson Lyceum was formed in 2016 to honor the memory of Woodson, reconnect him and his achievements to Huntington and the state of West Virginia, provide strong support for teachers and students, serve as a resource for celebrating Black history, and encourage respect for freedom of the press. As such, we are following the teachings of Dr. Woodson. You may wonder why a journalist is involved with Woodson and Black history. I have two answers. One, when the Woodson professorship was created a quarter century ago, the university leadership believed that journalism would provide the greatest influence on diversity on campus. And two, Dr. Woodson used journalists and their news organizations to promote Black history to the public. His scholarly journals and books alone would not do it. He sought the support of journalists, and the rest is history. He was also a journalist. I am certain most of you know Dr. Woodson was a historian who became the father of Black history because he wanted to restore Black achievements in history after many years of neglect. However, he was also one of the leading proponents of quality and inclusion in education. In addition, one of his last acts as Dean of Liberal Arts at Howard University was an article on the special kind of education schools should provide student journalists. On freedom of the press, when Dr. Woodson summarized important achievements of the early 20th century, in 1938, he cited the Black press as the most significant success story of that period. Our guest speaker today has an important link to Dr. Woodson and the anniversaries of the 15th and 19th Amendments. We will be celebrating this year. It is her area of scholarship. She studied at Howard University and is employed at Harvard in the same department where Woodson became the second African American to receive a doctorate. If you do the calculations, you'll quickly realize that Woodson received his Harvard degree from the Department of History at Harvard more than a century ago. However, Harvard didn't hire his first Black History Department chair until recently, when Dr. Higginbotham got the job. Dr. Higginbotham is the 5th guest lecturer to provide the Woodson Lecture. She is preceded by Bishop Sam Moore, Earl Lewis, former president of the Mellon Foundation, Dr. Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Norfolk State University. Dr. Higginbotham also is president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, the organization Carter G. Woodson founded in 1915. Her father was editor of the Negro History Bulletin, which Woodson founded in 1937. Several people here will be visiting the Woodson home in Washington in a few weeks, and they should know Evelyn used to visit it as a toddler with her father. Of Dr. Woodson's dedication to correcting facts and ignorance about blacks in history, she once told an interviewer in explaining Woodson's cause, quote, "He was dealing with a prominent historical interpretation that said slaves were happy, slavery prepared blacks for trades, that Reconstruction was a terrible mistake." So he's coming out of school realizing that history had to do more than write books. It had to organize to tell a whole truthful story. So he started a movement, bringing people together, not just African Americans, to recognize how important Black people's accomplishments have been in American society. Dr. Higginbotham earned a PhD from the University of Rochester in American History, an MA from Howard University, and her BA from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Before Harvard, she taught at Dartmouth, the University of Maryland, and the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Higginbotham is co-author with the late John Hope Franklin of recent editions of the American History Survey book, From Slavery to Freedom. She is drafting the 10th edition. It was first published in 1947 when Woodson's book, Negro in Our History, was the leading textbook and had been so for the previous 25 years. Dr. Higginbotham has also co-authored other works with West Virginia's own Henry Louis Gates, such as a multi-volume reference African American national biography, containing more than 4,000 biographical entries, and co-edited with Dr. Gates, African American Lives. She was the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Guide to African American History and co-edited History and Theory, Feminist Research, Debates, and Contestations. Many in this room also know her from her book, Righteous Discontent, The Women's Movement in the Black Baptist Church, which won her a truckload of awards from such organizations as the American Historical Association, the American Academy of Religion, the Association of Black Women Historians, and the Association for Research on Nonprofit and Voluntary Organizations. President Obama presented her with the National Humanities Medal in 2014. In a recent interview, Dr. Higginbotham said, "History for me is a way to talk not just about the past, but to use the past for interpretation, for information, for a lot of different things." I could spend much longer citing her work and being in awe, but I think you would prefer I sit down and be quiet. And without further delay, I am honored to present Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham.
Welcome. I am just so pleased to be here this evening. I want to thank Burnis Morris and the institutional supporters of the Woodson Lyceum program this evening. I am honored to give the Carter Woodson lecture during Black History Month. I also want to express my admiration for your president. You have a wonderful president, President Jerome Gilbert. He's not here to get this praise. Be sure to tell him I think he's wonderful. I also want to extend my sincere appreciation to Montserrat Miller and the Drinko Academy, and to Laura Diener and the Women and Gender Studies for making this event and my experience here such a wonderful and memorable occasion. So as you heard from the introduction, I am the president, the national president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. In Woodson's time, it was called the Study of Negro Life and History. We were founded in 1915, so we are 105 years old. In Woodson's time, we celebrated Negro History Week, and I wasn't a toddler this whole time enjoying Negro History Week. I was getting quite old, but we now are the Black History Month, and every year we develop an annual theme. And this year's theme is African Americans and the Vote, which in 2020, as you know, marks the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 15th Amendment and the centennial, the 100th year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Now, the two historic anniversaries teach us about the struggle for equality in America on the part of both men and women. The commemoration of these historic anniversaries provides an opportunity for celebration and for introspection, a time for contemplating both amendments in regard to one another and in regard to their far-reaching potential as well as their limitations. As a women's historian, I want to talk to you today about understanding the women's suffrage movement from a historical perspective. And to do so requires looking at the past through the lens of truth. It requires searching out that which has been hidden and discovering historical actors whose names and stories we hardly know, if we know at all. It requires recognizing the 19th Amendment's differing meanings and impact for white and black women. Now, this engagement with the past can be painful, but it is also restorative. And in this dual sense, I think of an article that came out in the New York Times last year, and it was an article that criticized, in fact, lambasted, the monument that was to be constructed in New York Central Park in honor of the women's rights movement. If you read that article, you know that the controversy was over the sculpture of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And it came to the public's attention through an op-ed article by Professor Martha Jones at Johns Hopkins University that appeared last March, and Brent Staples, who is a writer for the New York Times, also criticized the sculpture in May. Now, they criticized the monument to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and to Susan B. Anthony because they said such a monument revealed historical amnesia when it came to the role of black women in the movement. And they both called attention to what they called a whitewashing of history. Martha Jones, who's written extensively on the 19th century role of black women and their advocacy of women's suffrage, noted that the omission of Sojourner Truth was especially glaring, since Sojourner Truth was a New Yorker. She was born into slavery in upstate New York in 1797, and she lived most of her life after freedom in 1826 in New York City. It was Sojourner Truth who attended the first of a series of what was called National Women's Rights Conventions. And these followed after the famous Seneca Falls Convention that launched the women's movement in 1848. But these subsequent conventions were held annually in different states. And the first one was held in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. Sojourner Truth attended that 1850 meeting, although neither Elizabeth Cady Stanton nor Susan B. Anthony were present at that meeting. Truth, therefore, was a pioneering figure in the early years of the women's movement. The case of the New York Monument is instructive because the criticism leveled at the planners called attention to their lack of historical knowledge, to the omission of African American women's history in the history of women, as well as their flagrant disregard of primary sources. For those of you who take history courses, you will hear historians say that. Primary sources are important. They are the first-hand accounts that document the actual words and activities. And in this case, they would be the actual accounts of white and black suffragists. In fact, the women's suffragist movement was vibrant in the African American community. The campaign was born out of the anti-slavery movement. And from the beginning, there were always white and black women who demanded gender equality. And not just women. Men could be feminists too. In fact, the most outstanding male feminist was Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist Frederick Douglass. He attended the famous 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, and in fact, he is identified as the person who made the speech that helped to sway the vote in favor of the resolution for women's suffrage at that historic meeting. Historians have for many years now discussed the rift that occurred between the women's movement and the African American movement, so to speak, after the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments. White women suffragists who had been abolitionists, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, felt betrayed that women were not included. I often have this debate in my classes. Sojourner Truth was one of the very few black women who sided with Stanton and Anthony on this question. Most black suffragists didn't. They didn't agree with Truth. Instead, they felt that this moment of Reconstruction, these are the years right after the Civil War, were primarily about the end of slavery, about conferring citizenship rights to African Americans, particularly because black men fought in the Civil War, and they had helped to save the Union. Now, this debate was tense, but for many African Americans, including Frederick Douglass, and including black women suffragists and feminists, this moment right after the Civil War was the Negro's hour, as they called it. And so they understood the all-male vote, which was about to be conferred to black men, to be an easier fight to win, an easier compromise than jeopardizing the vote altogether with the more radical demand for women's suffrage. But why was this? I mean, why did they have to make that kind of choice? Understanding the larger historical context of male suffrage in the United States helps to answer the question. After the Revolutionary War, and you know, the thing about the Revolutionary War is that it was fundamentally about the vote. Taxation without representation is about the vote. After the Revolutionary War and after the founding of our national government, most adult Americans could not vote. And they couldn't vote because of property qualifications for voting and because of gender qualifications. You had to be a property-owning man to vote. Very briefly, property-owning women in New Jersey voted, but that ended in 1807. Beginning in the first decade of the 19th century, escalating in the late 1820s, and culminating in the 1830s, states began to democratize the vote. And by democratizing the vote, I mean that state legislatures began to pass laws that rescinded the property requirements, took away the property requirements so that men without land or property could vote. Working men who didn't have all these things could now for the first time vote. Ironically, this democratizing process while swelling the white male electorate, had the opposite result for black voters, because state legislatures enacted at the very same time laws specifically to disfranchise those black men, even black property holders, who had earlier voted in some of the northern and even the southern states. Black property holders at the founding of the nation were voting in Maryland and in Tennessee and in North Carolina. But they would soon find it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to vote. So let me give you some examples. In 1802, the Maryland State Constitution noted explicitly, and I quote, that every free white male citizen of this state and no other shall have a right of suffrage. Black voters in New Jersey were disfranchised in 1807, disfranchised meaning losing the right to vote. So even if you were a property-owning black man, and that's the only way you could have voted before 1807, and in New Jersey, a property-owning white woman, you could vote, or any woman. But after 1807, all that changed. In 1822, blacks in Rhode Island lost the right to vote. New York opened up the right of suffrage for its white male citizens, but only allowed blacks with certain property, and it was a pretty steep amount at that time, to vote. As late as 1842, Pennsylvania took the vote away from its black voters. So when the Civil War ended in 1865, the overwhelming majority of blacks, North and South, could not vote. In fact, in debating whether to allow black soldiers to fight in the Civil War, because initially, Lincoln and the Congress didn't want to bring black soldiers into the Civil War, but they do out of necessity. And when they bring them out of necessity to win the war and also to meet the quotas of some of the southern and some of the northern states, to meet the quotas in the northern states, they were taking the freed slaves or the emancipated slaves from the Emancipation Proclamation, who, if you saw the movie Glory, they're coming off the plantations, and they are joining the Union Army, meeting the quotas necessary for some of those northern states. Black soldiers were fundamental to Union victory. Over 200,000 are now recognized as fighting on the Union side. And thus, for the champions of the 14th and 15th Amendments, it was important to have the vote. In fact, again, in the debates in Congress before the Emancipation Proclamation, because the Emancipation Proclamation not only freed the slaves, but the second part of it was to turn blacks into the Union military. But even before that, as Congress is debating it, one of the congressmen from Ohio asserts, well, if you let them fight, you're going to have to give them citizenship, and you're going to have to give them the vote afterward. And that's exactly what the demand was. Blacks, after the war, they met and they said, if we were good enough to carry muskets in the war, we're good enough to carry ballots afterwards. And so the 14th Amendment, well, the 13th Amendment frees the slaves. The 14th Amendment provides citizenship for birthright people, and African Americans were in this country right there at the beginning, so they were birthright citizens. And then the 15th Amendment, of course, gives the vote to black men. Thus, the racial inclusion of male voters by many people, black and white, who were sympathetic, including Lincoln even, was perceived to be a simpler matter, especially right after the war, than gender inclusion. When the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, several of the northern states refused to ratify it. And therefore, when it became the law of the land, in some places, black men who went to the polls for the very first time were mobbed and even killed. This happened in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, in 1872. One of its leading black educators, a man named Octavius Cato, was killed in his efforts to try to vote. The ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870 proved to be a defining moment in the women's suffrage movement, which afterward took on a national presence with the founding and activities of the National Woman Suffrage Association. So the National Woman Suffrage Association was led by Stanton, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, by Susan B. Anthony later, by Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. And the National Women's Suffrage Association was famous for leading this 1913 March on Washington. Perhaps this is the first interracial march on Washington. And in 1913, it was quite a grand parade. At the head of it was a woman, Inez Milholland. Google her. She's riding a white horse, leading thousands of women. The parade took place on March 3rd, the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson as President of the United States. And as the women are marching, they faced a jeering and threatening crowd. It took courage to march. It's also worth noting that by 1913, the National Women's Suffrage Association strove to win state support for the amendment because states had to ratify it. Now, initially, they were thinking if each state had its own vote, that women could get the right to vote. But they recognized that wasn't going to work. So what they needed was an actual federal amendment that would force the states to respect it. And while state support in this way sounds innocent enough, perhaps even shrewd political maneuvering, this strategy entailed collusion with southern states that had already passed laws to turn back the clock on black freedom and any vestige of racial equality left from the Reconstruction years. In the 1880s and 1890s, southern state constitutions, one after the other, legalized racial segregation and various voter-related schemes. In fact, Mississippi was the first. The Mississippi Plan, 1890, was the first to begin the process of taking the vote away. Now imagine, the 15th Amendment is there. They couldn't take the 15th Amendment away. But what they could do is come up with a lot of schemes that just nullified that you could actually vote. And what were some of those schemes? The poll tax, the grandfather clause, if your grandfather voted, but if your grandfather was voting in 1860, most black people were slaves in 1860. Something called literacy tests. In fact, students at Harvard Law School did use the literacy test that they were using then and realized they couldn't even pass it because some of the questions were, how many bubbles are in the sea? Repeat the portion of the Constitution backward. I mean, okay, there was one that said something about spelling, and the requirement for spelling, the registrar had misspelled himself, the word spelling. He had spilling. By 1913, black men were overwhelmingly disfranchised in the South, despite the 15th Amendment. They were politically powerless, and this was underscored by the passage of Jim Crow laws, by inadequately funded schools, and sometimes no schools in communities at all, by rampant mob violence, lynching, convict leasing, and convict leasing imprisoned black men, women, and children. If you Google convict leasing children, you'll see little boys in black and white. There's a book and a movie, a documentary on convict leasing by Douglas Blackman. African Americans had no meaningful access to the national government in the late 19th, early 20th century. The Supreme Court had rendered its opinion on the constitutionality of segregation in 1896 in the case Plessy v. Ferguson, and the court's separate but equal doctrine in Plessy and its other rulings to follow had only one dissenting voice, and that one dissenting voice was a judge who came out of Kentucky, and this Justice John Harlan called these segregation decisions sophistry and hypocrisy. This is what he wrote about Plessy, and I quote him, "We boast of the freedom enjoyed by our people," and by our people he means Americans. "We boast of the freedom enjoyed by our people above all other peoples, but it is difficult to reconcile that boast with the state of the law which practically puts the brand of servitude and degradation upon a large class of our fellow citizens. The thin disguise of equal accommodations," Harlan went on to say, "the thin disguise will not mislead anyone, nor atone for this wrong this day done." So it's no wonder that the black educator Booker T. Washington would confront the reality of the times in a pragmatic way, and with the expedient proposition that blacks just need to relinquish their rights. They shouldn't worry about civil and political rights, at least not for now, in order to gain economic rights. And Booker T. Washington's was a message of racial self-help. Blacks would have no one else to depend upon, so they would have to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Now, it is in this exact same time that the National Woman Suffrage Association also took a pragmatic position, and it was one of expedience in pursuit of their goal to win Southern ratification. In the famous Women's March of 1913, which was in March, which I previously mentioned, the National Women's Suffrage Association made the decision to have black women march, because the black women were part of this movement now, and they're part of some of the white organizations and their own organizations, but they made the decision to have the black women march at the rear and separate from all of the other white groups. So even if you were a black woman like Ida B. Wells, and she was the famous anti-lynching crusader, but Ida B. Wells was a member of a racially integrated, largely white Illinois Equal Suffrage Association, which was part of the National Women's Suffrage Association. So imagine how she felt. She was stunned by the decision of the president of her state association to acquiesce to the national demand. The head of the Illinois women, a woman named Grace Wilbur Trout, and she was, again, the president of the Illinois suffragists, wrote that the state suffrage association wanted their member, Ida B. Wells, to march with them. But if the National doesn't want it, and I quote her, "If the National has decided it is unwise to include the colored women, I think we should abide by the decision." Ida B. Wells Barnett was appalled, but she was not deterred. The Chicago Tribune reporter covering the march in Washington noted that Wells Barnett appeared suddenly from the sidewalk, walked right into the march, calmly right into the Illinois contingent when it walked by. In fact, she positioned herself so that she could slide into the very front of the group. Soon afterward, the newspaper wrote this: "There was no question raised, and she finished the parade." She wrote to the national officers, and especially to her own Illinois sisters, because they wanted her to march. They just didn't want to rock the boat. And so she wrote to them, and I quote what she said: "Our women," talking about the Illinois women, "should be as firm in standing up for their principles as the Southern women are as firm in their prejudice." Now, in 1917, Carrie Chapman Catt, who was then the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, explained in unambiguous terms the racial exclusion inherent in the organization. In fact, when you read Elizabeth Cady Stanton and even Susan B. Anthony after the rift, after the 15th Amendment, they use racist language because they are so upset that black men have the vote and white women, especially educated women, don't. Well, well, Carrie Chapman Catt wrote a book of essays. She compiled a book of essays. Some of the essays were hers. And the book was called Women's Suffrage by Federal Constitutional Amendment. And again, this is very important, as she argues, why this has to be constitutional amendment. And so she dedicates the book, and I quote, "to the Congress of the United States and the legislatures of the several states." And then along with that dedication, she says what the book's purpose is, and I quote that: "It goes with the hope that it may lead to a better understanding of the reasons for a federal constitutional amendment, providing that no state shall deny the right to vote on account of sex." And in the book, Carrie Chapman Catt termed the denial of the women's vote a nationwide injustice. So she's outraged. This is an injustice that undermined the ideals of human liberties that we profess as a people. And these are lofty words, and who could disagree with these words, except that she goes on to interpret why we needed a federal amendment and no states' rights. Now, with the resistance to integration in the South and the resistance to black rights, the argument was always states' rights. The federal government could not say that a state had to treat all people equal. She's making just the reverse argument. She's saying, oh no, we can't leave this up to the states because we know these states aren't going to go along with it. Some might, some won't. So it's got to be a federal amendment. And so what she does is she makes, like a lawyer, 7 issues, and then she talks about each one. So she argues against those who maintain that a constitutional amendment would violate states' rights. That's the first thing she argues. And she explains that federal rights transcend states' rights, which is really interesting, flip here. And she specifically criticizes Southern Democrats for their objections to the ballots of women on this premise. However, her goal is to allay, it is to reduce the racial fears of Southern Democrats. And this is how she does it. She writes, to Southern members of Congress who oppose the federal amendment out of fear that it will enfranchise black women in their respective states and thereby challenges white supremacy. So this is a big issue for her. I need to tell you, Congressman, I know why you don't want states' rights, but you don't really have anything to fear. Katz seeks to prove the contrary, that they don't have anything to fear, because she emphasizes the maintenance of white supremacy, because in the 15 states south of the Mason and Dixon line, population statistics confirm the numerical preponderance of white women over black women. White women numbered 8,700,000, while black women numbered only a little over 4,300,000, the latter forming less than half the number of white women. And then she displays a chart. Now, she does acknowledge, President Gilbert, that there are more black women in Mississippi, there are more in South Carolina, and there's a very high percentage of blacks in Alabama. But she assures her readers that in those states, which have already disfranchised black men, that would effectively disfranchise black women. And she concludes, and I quote her, so this isn't me, woman suffrage in the South would so vastly increase the white vote that it would guarantee white supremacy if it otherwise stood in danger of overthrow. Now, despite the racism on all fronts, the women's suffrage movement in the black community continued to grow in the late 19th century and the years leading up to the 19th Amendment. African Americans could not and would not disassociate the meaning of the woman's vote from their own rights as citizens through the 14th Amendment, and also the voting rights guaranteed in the 15th Amendment. In 1915, the Crisis magazine, and the Crisis, the monthly periodical of the NAACP, featured articles by African American women supporters of women's suffrage, and the contributors included both men and women. The African American suffragist, Mary Church Terrell, wrote about ballots for women in the context of the 15th Amendment. And Mary Church Terrell was among the founders of the National Association of Colored Women in 1897, which was very much a suffragist organization. And she was also very active, though, in a number of predominantly white women's organizations. And as a resident in Washington, D.C., she was even a member of the League of Women Voters, which was predominantly white. But in her essay in the Crisis in 1915, Terrell emphasized that all African Americans, women and men alike, should endorse the suffrage amendment. She believed that it would be profoundly hypocritical for any African American to oppose granting the ballot to women if they believe that colored men, I'm quoting her, should enjoy this right which citizenship confers. Now, the African American women contributors to the women's suffrage issue of the crisis emphasized a variety of benefits, and different people talked about different things. One outcome was simply an anti-racist and anti-sexist attitude. Another benefit was greater influence over the schools. A black woman educator in Boston noted, and I quote her, "Women teachers in those states," and Massachusetts was one of these states, where school suffrage had been already granted. So they didn't have the right to vote for Congress people and that kind of thing, but they did have the right to vote over school issues, school bond issues. And what she says is that in those states, local schools have been kept by the women's vote from the control of persons who threatened all that was best in those schools. The feminist Nannie Helen Burroughs, who was an African-American religious woman, a club woman, a woman's suffragist, and I write a lot about her, stressed that black men must be more forceful in demanding the vote and absolutely should not hinder women's pursuit of the vote. Now, at this time, which was really the low point in race relations, one historian that I had at Howard, Rayford Logan, called it the nadir, which means the low point in race relations during these years between the 1890s into the 1910s. This is what Burroughs wrote. "I was asked by a Southern white woman who was an enthusiastic worker for votes for white women, 'What can a Negro do with the ballot?' I asked her, 'What can she do without it?' Black women promoted the importance of women's suffrage in a variety of contexts. They did it in their secular clubs, they did it in their church work. And I've written, as Burnis Morris has said, a book on women in the Black Baptist Church. There were over 2 million women in this movement that I talk about, the Women's Auxiliary to the National Baptist Convention. And when you read their proceedings, it is very clear that they endorse women's suffrage. In 1909 and 1919, the minutes for both those 2 years, their annual meeting states, and these are thousands of women delegates from the United States, record that women's political voice was needed in state legislatures and in the government, the federal government, in order to improve the working conditions and wages of black women, many of whom worked as domestic servants. So it wasn't just simply that you wanted the right to vote as a matter of principle or even for schools, but how do women's economic interests get met? In 1912, the same group, the Women's Convention, endorsed the presidential candidacy of Theodore Roosevelt. He was running on the Progressive Party platform, and they explicitly referenced the party's support of women's suffrage. It was also a platform that spoke against alcohol and also against child labor. The minutes of their meeting that year recorded, and I quote these Baptist women, "If women cannot vote, they should make it very uncomfortable for the men who have the ballot but do not know its value." And during World War I, between 1914 and 1918, there's tremendous migration out of the South to the North. In fact, more than 600,000 black people move out of southern cities and out of southern farms to northern cities. And when they do so, they gain political power, the men. This was especially true of the massive migration to Chicago. And interestingly, in Chicago, women did exercise the right to vote because in Illinois, the state had legalized women's suffrage as early as 1913. Well, Northern church records showed that women's groups in cities with large amounts of black migrants assisted in their political mobilization and promoted voter education. Nannie Helen Burroughs and the other leaders of these Black Baptist women also advocated that churches form suffrage clubs, voter clubs. And at their annual meeting in 1920, they celebrated the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And they commended by name, they mentioned by name Susan B. Anthony, Anna Howard Shaw, Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt. They praised them while at the same time citing the racism of those women as a cause for the limited participation of black women in that organization. But the minutes of the Baptist women document their continued voice for women's vote in influencing labor laws. And here's another good quote. For industrial and economic reasons, the ballot will be a sure defense for women in industries who should demand equal pay for equal work. And that does sound familiar, doesn't it? Equal pay for equal work. It's also worth remembering that religious faith inspired Southern black women to continue to persevere for the vote during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. In the 1950s, for example, the NAACP worker Ruby Hurley made her appeals through religious language and symbols. And you have to recall that just to register to vote could get you killed. It got 3 civil rights workers, black and white, killed. It got many people beaten, such as Fannie Lou Hamer, just for trying to register herself and to register others. How do you mobilize people under those kinds of circumstances? Well, Ruby Hurley turned to the Bible, and I quote her, "I found using the Bible to be effective in saying to our people, you go to church on Sunday, or you go every time the church doors are open. You say amen before the minister even has the word out of his mouth. Yet you tell me you're afraid. Now, how can you be afraid and be honest when you say, my faith looks up to thee, or when you sing that God's going to take care of you? If you don't believe it, then you're not really the Christian you say you are." And that challenge to the faith of poor black women like Fannie Lou Hamer in the Mississippi Delta gave the courage to risk life and limb to register Southern blacks to vote in the early 1960s. It is, as President Gilbert stated, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 represented the fruition of the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment. With the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, black women in the South, just as black women in other parts of the nation, went to the polls. News accounts note how the initial appearance of black Southern women took the white poll monitors by surprise, because they knew the black men weren't going to come to the polls because of disfranchisement laws. They weren't expecting to see black women who came. Now the women would be soon turned away. In other places, though, outside the South, these black women were able to mobilize and cast their votes in affirmation of those who supported black interests and causes. And they were able to campaign against those who didn't support them. African Americans in the North ran for office, and they won. The conflation of women's suffrage and black urban migration made possible far greater political opportunity and leverage for blacks as a group in the northern cities. And it also served to broaden black women's perceptions of their own influence and activism. So with the ballot in hand, black club women, members of the National Association of Colored Women, used their networks and their news organs to form Republican clubs. And they reformed these Republican clubs. At this time, black women are firmly in the party of Lincoln. This is before Roosevelt. But to give you a sense of where these clubs were, they were in Illinois, they were in New Jersey, they were in New York, they were in West Virginia, they were in Oklahoma, they were in Minnesota, California, and other states. And through the 1920s, African Americans were overwhelmingly wedded to the party of Lincoln. So in 1924, black women at the state and local levels formed the National League of Republican Colored Women. And they stated forcefully the slogan, "We are in politics to stay, and we shall be a stay in politics." In the 1920s, black club women also joined the League of Women Voters. Individual black women held membership in some of the predominantly white state leagues. As I mentioned, Mary Church Terrell was one of those for the District of Columbia. But more often than not, separate black leagues existed, such as California's Alameda County League of Colored Women Voters, and the San Francisco Colored League of Women Voters, the Frederick Douglass League of Women Voters in Chicago. And all of these are formed because they were discouraged from active participation in the white leagues. But they did interesting work. So one of the things that the Chicago Frederick Douglass League did was to develop citizenship schools and a Get Out the Vote campaign in 1924. The history and legacy of African Americans and the vote teach important lessons, and they teach lessons for the study of democracy in America. Lessons about the pursuit of equal justice and equal rights, regardless of race, regardless of sex and sexuality. Lessons about perseverance in the wake of collective victories and collective defeats. These were people who never gave up. They just persevered over the decades. The story teaches us about Black and white women, indeed women of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. And the legacy of Black women and the vote reminds us of the importance of access to the ballot in the furtherance of women's rights and women's interests. And not least of all, this history teaches important lessons about sisterhood, about its many challenges and its many rewards. Lessons about sisterhood in theory and in practice. Lessons about sisterhood understood by our words and then understood by our deeds. So I leave you with this one lesson, and they come from the words of Sojourner Truth. If women want any rights more than they got, why don't they just take them and not be talking about it?